1991 proved to be a hugely successful year for female-led thrillers, with Sleeping with the Enemy and The Silence of the Lambs among the biggest grossing films of the year. So, naturally, the following year, more female-led creepy thrillers emerged.
I adore children, Mrs. Fartell. I love being with them. I love taking care of them. For me, it's the next best thing to actually being a mother.
In 1992, Amanda Silver wrote a movie about a seemingly harmless white woman played by Rebecca De Mornay who infiltrates an affluent middle-class home with plans to snatch their children. Later that year came a slicker, sexier movie about a woman played by Jennifer Jason Leigh who moves into a New York apartment with designs to befriend and ultimately become her roommate.
I'm like you now.
Both films had modest budgets, but both grossed huge amounts of money. And at a point in time when the horror genre was famously experiencing a bit of a dip, these glossy high-end thrillers became two of the most talked about and culturally relevant horror films of the era. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of home invasion, and we discuss The Hand That Rocks the Cradle and Single White Female. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer, and as ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 9th season exploring the evolution of home invasion, and this is part 17. In this week's episode, as that intro suggested, we are going to be looking at two more glossy 90s thrillers, Single White Female and The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. Both of these discussions will be spoilerific, so please do give them both a watch. They're so much fun before you listen to our discussion. So joining me to discuss this week's films, I've got a brilliant returning guest with me. She is a woman of many talents. She is a writer, producer, video editor. She does a lot of brilliant video essays for the BFI. She was last here on the podcast discussing A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night with me, and she's back. It's Maha Albadrawi. Hello, Maha.
Be careful, she's crazy.
She is crazy.
Hi, Mike.
I mean, if it's the one thing I've learned, Maha, from all of these films recently, it's that all women are crazy. All women are out to get me. I don't trust any of them, to be honest.
Well, neither do I anymore, Mike. Not after watching today's films.
I love it. Well, before we get into today's films, let me ask you about home invasion. Now, there are different types of home invasion that we've been exploring this season. There's the kind of big, brutal, violent, traditional home invasion stuff. And then there's stuff like we're going to talk about today, right? The kind of more insidious home invasion about people kind of coming to upset the domestic equilibrium, I suppose. But however you interpret home invasion, Maha, what are your thoughts on that subgenre? What do you think of it?
It's funny that you say that, because the first thing I thought of was actually the films that we're going to talk about today. And I remember when you announced your season, the first thing that came to mind was Single White Female. And I think that might be because that was the first kind of, it was one of the first one of the first horror genres that I saw. And I think, I don't know why, I think there was just a lot of them in the 90s that were on TV. And I was just kind of exposed to them by accident. So there's the, kind of like taking over your life from the inside kind of genre, which I love. And then there's the other genre, which is genuinely terrifying, which I can't watch too much of, like, the proper home invasion.
People bursting into a house wearing masks and torturing and murdering people, right?
And Panic Room. Those are truly terrifying. I only need to watch those once, and then that's it. That's enough for me. But, there's a soft home invasion.
Yeah.
Dare I say it.
Exactly. I love that. And the kind of soft core home invasion, right? And that is interesting, which links nicely into the other topic we're going to talk about, which are these kind of soft core erotic thrillers, I suppose, right? From the sort of late 80s and early 90s. There was such a wave of them. We've already discussed quite a lot of them. We've talked about Fatal Attraction, and we've talked about Sleeping with the Enemy and Fear. What do you think of this kind of strange little movement of thrillers that we got at this time, Maha?
I love it. It is one of my top, it's one of my favorite subgenres of film in general, like or horror as well. Like, I think it was like this perfect storm. It was post is it second wave feminism of the 70s, or is it third wave? I can't remember.
Second wave,
so it's kind of like a reaction to that second wave of feminism, with women like pushing themselves into these traditionally male spaces and into the workforce and being more visible in everyday life. And there was, this turn towards conservatism and across both the UK and the US. And then also there's this other thing happening with all these European filmmakers who were kind of like that sort of almost like the same age as George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, but they come with a European sensibility.
Yes.
And they contribute these really stunning unusual, like really distinct visuals to these films that were like Adrian Lyne, Barbet Schroeder, the key filmmakers of this genre. I always think of as being British or European. And
yeah, you're right. Paul Verhoeven, obviously, Basic Instinct, and all of those. I immediately think of Paul Verhoeven when I think of a lot of these movies. Yeah.
Paul Verhoeven.
Yeah, it is a really fascinating little era, and I found it really interesting over the last few weeks that all of my guests that have, like yourself, people that are really into this kind of movement, this genre, are women. Like, and I think that is another really interesting thing, because there is one argument to say that these movies are quite male gazy, and they can be quite conservative, and they can punish women. But there is also something that kind of clearly is striking a chord with female audiences as well, which is really interesting, right? How do you feel about that? And do you think these movies were aimed at a female audience?
I think that the reason that these films appeal, like if they appeal to women, I think it's because they appeal to this like baseline fear that we maybe have but don't like to talk about, or that of being replaced.
Yes.
In some way, like both of them are about someone coming in and trying to replace you in your own life. And it's a very ugly fear, but I think it's something that people have. And I think they also take female relationships, like relationships and friendships between females, seriously, to the point where, it becomes the crux of the film. So, I mean, they're not very evolved. They're not perfect. They're 30 years old, and it shows. But there is something there, like in the friendship between Ali and Hetty, I saw something familiar, like that very intense friendship that you have with someone when you meet and you just click.
Totally. I think actually, rewatching it this week, I think Single White Female is one of the best examples of these movies. And I think it's because it actually feels like it gets women, and it gets the dynamic between women. Whereas some other films in this, like Fatal Attraction, of course, it's a great movie. It's so much fun. It's a really fun, schlocky genre ride. But it is a movie that kind of really places Michael Douglas as the hero, as the sympathetic protagonist, right, at the front and center of that.
Yeah, totally. Like, it somehow sympathizes with this man who basically just doesn't want to deal with the consequences of his actions.
Yes, exactly that. And also it has a slightly conservative message, I think, too, doesn't it? That the family, don't come and disrupt the kind of nuclear family, or else, things will be, you'll be punished, and you'll be punished for having sex and everything else as well,
Yeah, definitely. Do not mess with the home. And also, and I mean, I think that Hand That Rocks the Cradle has a similar sort of message, especially with the way it ends.
Yes.
That final shot of the untouched home. That I got that message loud and clear, mister.
I know, it's so funny. Do you have a particular favourite, Maha, from this like weird little era of movies? Any highlights for you?
Single White Female.
Yeah.
I love it. I think that film has a really, really beautiful visual style. It's almost Hitchcockian. I think that it doesn't delve into it enough, but I think there's something interesting in there about voyeurism and between the two female characters. It's like a perfect encapsulation of fashion of 1992.
Yes.
That haircut, that is a bold haircut. I love it.
It's so bold. It is. There is nothing more early 90s than Single White Female, right? Even the soundtrack, there's like that kind of like sleazy like enigma music and all this kind of stuff, and the haircuts, like you say, the production design, that beautiful apartment. We'll get to it anyway, but yes, you're right, it's so of its time.
The real estate, Mike, real estate in this film.
I've got many thoughts about that, mainly in the how do they afford that, but anyway, we'll get to that. And also there's that, there is this kind of like, eroticism that you don't really like. I know there's been a lot of discourse about this recently online. Like, people talk a lot about has cinema become too sexless, like mainstream cinema, or in this kind of like post-Marvel, Disney owning everything age? Has sex kind of vanished from movies, do you think? Because it feels like we don't really get movies like the classic erotic thriller anymore, right?
No, we don't. And we also don't get a lot of romanticism in movies, or at least not in American films. I remember so well when, this is going to sound like a strange segue, but I've been working on a Disney video, so forgive me. But remember when Frozen came out and everyone was like, she doesn't need a man. It's about the relationship between her and her sister. Her sister is her one true love.
Yes.
And ever since then, we've just been completely ignored. I feel like American films have just been completely ignoring like desire and lust in films, and how that can really drive people fucking crazy. And there's definitely a weird, it's almost like we've gone too far the other way since the 90s.
Yeah. And do you think, this is something I talked a bit about last week with Alex West, do you think it's also just because people can access porn these days so much easier than they ever could? Because it used to be in the 90s, you know, for me when I was young, these movies were the only place where I could access, you know, sexy sex scenes and that kind of thing when they were on TV late at night or whatever. Whereas now, people don't necessarily need to go to the movies to see sexy stuff anymore. They can all access it, you know, in the privacy of their own home at the press of a button, I suppose. I
think that's definitely had something to do with it. I do wonder if that's kind of an oversimplified way of looking at it, because what these films also have is this kind of like voyeuristic sensibility about them. They use voyeurism to build and really like lean into the tension, especially in single white female. And porn obviously doesn't have that. Porn is it's not about voyeurs. I mean, you know, unless that's your kink, fine. But like using voyeurism as like a story device, it doesn't really happen. It's all out there. It's all very like just get people off as fast as possible. Whereas this, I don't know. I don't think porn replaces eroticism necessarily, or lust or romanticism in a story in film. But I do think it's probably related, definitely.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting. But I wonder if this era will ever come back. There have been a couple of attempts recently, right, to kind of bring back the erotic thriller. There was that Ben Affleck and Anna Darmus one, made by Adrian Lyne.
Yeah,
right?
It was.
Just completely crashed and burned. So I don't know. Maybe this is just so much of its time. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, I think it must be of its time. But also Adrian Lyne is in his like 70s, 80s now. He's a different filmmaker. He's working under different conditions. I don't think it will come back, because we are in a different time, and time moves only one way, and that's forward. So I don't think it will come back. And you know what you should do? You should just rewatch the old films, because every time you watch it, you see something new. This is maybe like my 8th watch of Single White Female.
I love it. I love it.
I enjoy it.
That's incredible. Well, let's get into it. We're going to start discussing both these movies. We're going to kick things off with The Hand That Rocks the Cradle from 1992.
The Bartells couldn't believe how fortunate they were to find Peyton.
I adore children, Mrs. Bartell. I love being with them. I love taking care of them. For me, it's the next best thing to actually being a mother.
But they didn't find her.
She seems terrific. What's the catch?
There is no catch. I think she's great.
She chose them.
You never let an attractive woman take a power position in your home. All I'm saying is you have to watch your back.
Now, their innocence is her opportunity.
He has your eyes, you know.
Do you really think so?
Their trust
Peyton's been great.
Has she?
I don't know what we would have done without her.
is her weapon, the hand that rocks the cradle.
So this movie stars Rebecca De Mornay as a woman whose husband commits suicide after he is accused of sexually assaulting his patients. He is a gynecologist, and the patient who first accuses him is our lead, Claire, who's played by Annabella Sciorra.
Mm-hmm.
And so she accuses him, and then 4 more women come forward. He commits suicide. Rebecca De Mornay, from the trauma of this, loses her baby. She's pregnant, I should have said. So she was pregnant. She loses her baby and apparently her mind, because instead of getting angry at her husband, she decides to go after the woman who first accused him of sexual assault.
Yes.
Correctly as well, because we see it happen.
Yes, absolutely. There's no ambiguity there to that, right?
No,
It's
it's pretty, I will say it's pretty tastefully handled for a movie of that era.
It's very
but
disturbing, actually. It's very
it
upsetting
is so disturbing.
scene. Yeah.
And it's familiar for anyone who's been in a situation where someone in a position of authority does something that doesn't feel quite right, but they're totally in a position of power. But yeah, so after that, she gets a job as a nanny in this woman's house.
Yep.
Why that woman needs a nanny, I don't know, but she does. And then she slowly starts to like gaslight her and destroy her life.
Yeah. Yep. I've talked about the film Gaslight a lot in this series. We covered Gaslight in, I think, the second or third episode of this series.
Gaslight.
And that in some ways feels like the ultimate domestic horror movie, the kind of home invasion, home set horror movie. That idea that the enemy is within is in your house with you.
Yeah, the calls coming from within the house.
Exactly. And you can very much see that throwback to these kind of what they used to call in the 1940s. They used to call them women's pictures, right?
Women's pictures,
these kind of domestic set films that centered on women in the home. And it really does feel like a return to that with these sorts of movies, doesn't it? Just with added sex, basically.
Yeah,
brilliant.
Exactly.
So what do you think of The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, Maha? What did you think of it?
I thought it was interesting. It was really well made. It was very efficient. Things that I liked about it are Rebecca De Mornay's performance. She is absolutely chilling. And we'll talk about more. We'll talk about that more later. But like, I enjoyed it. I think, it has some plot holes. A huge one at the end. It also has some very reductive stereotypes, or one particularly reductive stereotypes, which made me just like cringe on my couch physically. And also a very bland husband, which is perfect because the men are really very like unnecessary here. Like, this is a story about three women, three archetypes.
Yes.
I also thought it really reminded me of how in the 90s, these very, very, very wealthy people were sort of like presented as if they were the norm. Like, that house is huge. That house is huge. No one lives in a house like that.
You're so right. That was a very 90s thing, wasn't it?
Like
any film, like Scream, right? Like, everyone looks like they're a millionaire. Home Alone, yeah. The beautiful, it's like house porn in the 90s, isn't it? It's unbelievable, yeah.
Yeah, and this movie really objectifies the house. Like, it starts off with those shots of the interiors of the house, and everything is, made to look beautiful and tidy and, well-stocked. And the first thing I thought was, who's cleaning this house?
Right. And also, what's really interesting, like you said in your synopsis, why on earth do they need a nanny? They are giving way more love and care and attention to their house than they're giving to their children, particularly the baby. Like, I feel like they keep forgetting they've got a baby in this film, right?
That baby is a plot device. Everything but those three women is a plot device. That annoying little girl is a plot device. The husband is a plot device. The help or a plot, the other help.
You're absolutely right.
And it's kind of like house porn, but I don't know who it's meant to appeal to, because it just, that house just looked I got this feeling that the house just had way too much stuff in it. Like, I find these big houses they're just boring. There's like nothing interesting about them. They're just full of stuff that no one uses, and it's just, it's excessive.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's what adds to the horror. Like, it feels almost like a kind of haunted house or something, this house.
Yeah.
It seems to just go on and on, like, particularly in that last act, the different cupboards and the hiding places and the rooms within rooms, beyond rooms, and like the staircases and the attic and the basement where the nanny stays. Like, it's a huge house, right? Which always does kind of work quite well in horror, because there are these kind of like little nooks and crannies and hidden rooms and cupboards and that kind of thing. And that definitely adds to it. Yeah.
It definitely gave me a sense of like the gothic horror. It reminded me a little bit of like books, like stories like Jane Eyre, where there's, hidden places in the house where you just don't know what's going on. And and the fact that it's so huge, is basically like a reason for them to not see what's going on, like right under their noses. Like, you can be in one room and not hear what's going on in the other.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that. Also, I think it's very well choreographed. Like the action in the film, like the house is used very well.
Yeah, it is. It is. Agreed. Like, I think that like you say, it's used for the story it's really used to enhance the story on the action, I think, of what's going on, for sure. And there is something, even the title, there is something that makes me think of like the Gothic when I hear the hand that rocks the cradle, right?
So can you explain that proverb to me? Because I did not Google it because I forgot. But like, what does it mean with the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world? Does that mean that mothers secretly rule the world, or the mothers actually? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So it's a poem by William Ross Wallace. It's from a poem from 1865, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. And it's basically a poem celebrating motherhood. Like, it begins, blessing on the hand of woman, angels guard her strength and grace, in the cottage, palace, hovel, oh, no matter where the place. So it goes on to kind of, basically, it's a poem that's celebrating mothers of the world. And it ends, the last two lines, for the hand that rocks the cradle is the hand that rules the world. So yeah, I think it's basically a kind of a poem that is appreciating women and mothers, and sort of saying that maybe, mothers actually rule the world, that they have all the power, I guess.
Yeah, but also that their labor is like unpaid and unrecognized, because that is not what this film was about.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? Although it is very much it's about the women really have the power in this film, right, over the men, I suppose. So I guess there is a bit of that to it, but it's just quite a cool. There's something quite creepy about the title, I think.
Yeah,
right?
I think it's a nice. It's quite a subversive title, because it's literally about a woman coming in and like taking your hand, like Claire's hand, off the cradle and replacing it with her own.
Yes. And there's always this. It goes back to the other movies we've talked about this series as well, that kind of threaten the woman in the home also means threatening the children, right? There's films like When a Stranger Calls. There's this like, why haven't you checked the children upstairs? This kind of like always threat against the children, the mother and the children, right? Like, and that is like always the big prevalent threat when you're talking about domestic set horrors and thrillers and that kind of thing as well. And there is something of the title that makes me think of that too, that makes me think that a baby is in danger, I think, when I think of the hand that rocks the cradle. Yeah.
I guess is meant to like provoke a sense of panic, you when you listen to it. It's like A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. Last film we talked about, where it's like that title, there's something frightening in that title, in that concept.
Yes. And what do you think of the way this movie is directed, like as a genre film? Because I think it's interesting that these movies also have a really interesting mix of feeling like, on the one hand, almost like romance dramas or something. When you think of like Sleeping with the Enemy, or I don't know, like even a bit of Fatal Attraction too, they kind of have this like gloss and sheen to them before they become genre films. This movie has a similar vibe, doesn't it? It's quite like brightly lit, and it's quite kind of soft focus, and it doesn't necessarily, not compared to Single White Female, which I think looks a lot darker and shadowier. This movie kind of doesn't look like a horror film at first glance, does it? I think
no, it doesn't. The horror kind of comes out of nowhere in specific moments. A lot of the time it feels like an advertisement for like domestic bliss.
Yes.
Because like Claire's entire life is taken up with her home. It's taken up with her children, with her stupid greenhouse, which is just so big.
Just take some time out from your greenhouse, I think, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, take a year out. Look, wait till little baby Joey or whatever his name is, starts walking, and then you'll be fine.
Yes.
Put him in daycare. But that's the thing. Like, everything is so focused around the house, and the house is shot and lit with so much care. I feel like it's an advertisement for a specific lifestyle, and the threat comes from outside, and it's a threat against it's a threat against the equilibrium of this kind of home, the domestic bliss. Family.
Yeah.
And it's so retrograde as well, because literally this is a family with like 2 kids, a mum and a dad, and mum doesn't work.
Mum is not, all she cares about is the greenhouse, literally.
Mum is not on maternity leave. Mum is just not working, because we don't have any reference to her working life, and dad's a genetic engineer, which is a very 90s, like, not going to question it. Yeah, sure. That sounds like a rich person job.
Do you think the movie is in any way commenting on that? Like, I don't know if it is, right? Is it aware of that? Like, is it kind of poking fun at these kind of white middle-class suburbanites and the mum that doesn't really work and yet still needs a full-time nanny? Is there something to that they're almost being sort of punished in some way for their lives? Or is that not there in this film? What do you think?
I'm not sure yet. I
Yeah.
have been thinking about that. I feel like this film is punishing Claire for not paying, like basically for not paying enough attention to her children, for
Yes.
bringing an outsider into her home, and for speaking up as well
Yes.
against her attacker.
It's very, very unambiguous, right? Like you said, that this doctor really has sexually assaulted several women. Like, he definitely was a wrong-un. He was a wrong-un, right? But I don't know, are we led to believe that he's the reason that she is also a bit of a wrong-un? As in, Mrs. Mott? Like, has he sort of abused her in this marriage, maybe? Like, is he the reason why she is the way she is? We don't really know that, but I wonder.
That's, when I said this film is efficient, that was partly what I was thinking of as well, is that we don't get a lot of like these characters' past lives or their inner lives. We just see what they do and how they react, and all of the like calls to action are in the film. Nothing, she's not pathologized, which is something that I think I'm not used to, because like a lot of films now, they go into their characters' past lives, their motivations, and I think there's a tendency to like pathologize a character as this is why they're acting like this, or give them explain their past trauma. Yeah, maybe sometimes too much. This one doesn't do that at all. So I don't know. It doesn't really suggest that she was complicit or abused herself. It doesn't suggest anything about Mrs. Mott.
No.
Like, all we know is that she lost her husband, she lost her house, and she lost her baby. Those are the three things that this film really, really, really fetishizes.
Yes.
And she's lost all of them, and she's going after the wrong person, in my opinion. But she's going after, the only person she can, because her dickhead husband, killed himself.
Also, by the way, I love the moment when she goes back to Mrs. Mott's flat and there's like a breast pump and stuff still there. Like, what? Why is that still in the house when an estate agent is showing them around?
And also that the man didn't know what it was. He's like, oh, that's a child's toy. And also that it was the wind chimes that set Julianne Moore off. Like, were wind chimes that unusual back then that they're like, oh, well, it must be her. She has wind chimes. You know who else has wind chimes? My mum. And my mother, boomer mums. Yeah. Oh my God, maybe it was a thing.
Maybe it was a thing. Maybe it only became a thing in the early 90s from this film onwards. Who knows? But wind chimes were fucking everywhere, weren't they? Yeah, I thought that was funny that was like a major plot device. Like, oh my God, wind chimes. It must be her house. It's like, what?
It's gotta be her.
So funny.
Yeah, also she's a bad villain if she's, taking this, the same wind chimes everywhere.
So funny. It's such a silly film, but I was here for the ride. I actually really enjoy this movie for what it is. I think it's a really fun genre film, and I do think it has I do always inherently find these kind of stories quite scary and disturbing, these kind of gaslighting stories where somebody is insidiously destroying someone else's life from within, like I always find it quite a difficult thing to watch, those sorts of films, and I think this film does it effectively. It is really good.
I think this film is also like pretty sympathetic to Claire, even though she's a little bit of a space cadet sometimes. So I think that also helped with the fear, because she really just didn't know what was going on.
Yes.
And also it preyed upon her insecurities as a new mother. Like, I thought that was actually really cleverly done. And I do think that sometimes you just need a little bit of schlock. You don't need to make everybody sympathetic.
No, absolutely. And the last act of this film goes completely batshit stupid. But I'm into it. Yeah. I'm very much into it. So what do you think of quote unquote Peyton, right? Mrs. Mott, Rebecca De Mornay. Again, she's like the kind of picture perfect, beautiful blonde woman who is good with children and is friendly to everyone, right? And she really kind of plays that up really well. But what do you think of her as our kind of villain?
I think that she is a really, 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 really smart villain. Because Rebecca De Mornay, I've seen her in two films. I've seen her in Risky Business and I've seen her in this. And in both films, she plays the American dream. She plays this platonic ideal of American pure womanhood physically, at least, like
yes.
and her physical appearance, like she looks like a Barbie doll. It's commented upon in both those films, and it's definitely a part of her. It's her weapon. She understands that she presents as this non-threatening, like lily white, trustworthy female because she is blonde and petite and has big blue eyes, and she's white, and she understands that she can move in these very wealthy suburban spaces without anybody questioning it.
Yes.
And I do wonder if the film and the filmmakers were aware of that when they were making the film, because it's quite pointed. Like she just walks into what's the dad's name? Sam, George, I don't know, it doesn't matter. Michael, let's call him Michael. Michael, she walks into his office, no one bats an eyelid. She's just able to like walk in. She walks literally, like her introduction into this film, like into Claire's life, blows my mind, because she literally just walks off the street and Claire's like, oh, hi. And she was like, hey, I heard from another nanny that like you were looking for a babysitter, and like I don't really have an appointment, but like, can I come over? And she just invites her into her home.
Yes, absolutely. Where
no
were her
questions
background checks here on
no
this woman?
No background checks. No, she just invites her to dinner. She's like, I like her.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, I think everybody likes her. So it feels quite pointed, the way that her freedom of movement in these spaces. I don't think that was by accident.
Yeah.
So I think that also like Rebecca De Mornay plays her so cold and so calculating and like a Hitchcockian blonde.
Yes.
Like she's the way that she switches from like warm when she's around the children to like ice cold when she's by herself and she's doing her little evil deeds. Really good. Really, really good.
You're right. There is something Hitchcockian about a lot of these movies, actually. There is something of a kind of vertigo to a lot of these films, I think, and that kind of like the blonde who maybe not what she appears to be and that kind of thing, right? But yeah, I completely agree with you. I think it's great casting. I think you are exactly as you said. She is exactly the kind of picture perfect, non-threatening woman that can move around this house unnoticed, doing all of these evil things, right? It's great.
Breastfeeding another woman's baby.
There's something so disturbing about that, I think, isn't there? It's really upsetting.
It's weird. Yeah.
It's really weird.
It's weird.
It's really weird. And you talked about how this was about these kind of these kind of archetypes of these three different types of women, right? Let's talk about the amazing Julianne Moore as well, who every time I watch this film, I completely forget she's in it. And I'm always like, oh, holy shit, Julianne Moore. What do you think of her and her character of Marlene in this?
I love Marlene. Oh my God. First of all, did you notice the pun related to her death? I only realized it afterwards.
No.
Okay, so let's talk about Marlene. Marlene is a career woman. She is a girl boss. She walks around with like tight skirts and this amazing like red bob. She is Claire's husband's childhood sweetheart.
Yes.
So therefore, another threat to Claire, another potential replacement for Claire. But I reckon I have this theory that that Marlene decided to go off to university or whatever, and like maybe like Sam or whatever the fuck, what was his name again? Michael was like, he was a little bit too boring to stay for her, and she went off, and like now she's this big real estate agent, and she flew away, and now she's back, but she's not like Claire. She's a career woman. She has no children. She wears gorgeous gowns and gorgeous gowns. She wears these gorgeous dresses, and she's very much focused on herself. Yeah. And the part is really small. I think it's really just there to contrast between the other two maternal figures in the film. You've got the maternal figure who's like, in the home, she's got two babies, and then you've got the thwarted maternal figure of Peyton / Mrs. Mott. And then you've got this absolutely non-maternal figure who has absolutely no interest in children, but is just there as a contrast, and also there for a bit of exposition because she explains. She's
a kind of plot device as well, in a way.
She's a plot device.
She's good to have there because she's there also as a kind of tool to tear this married couple apart potentially, right? Where as soon as Mrs. Mott gets wind that she was the ex of the husband, and she sets up this whole thing, right? But then also Marlene is kind of the one like doing the investigating. You get the great. I always love a movie movie, Maha, where someone sits on a kind of microfiche thing and goes through newspapers. Yeah, love it.
Yeah.
Love a microfiche
I've
montage.
always wanted to use a microfiche.
Yeah.
A microfiche. I've never done it. I've always wanted to.
I know, right?
But yeah, you know what? She's got the time, Mike, because she doesn't have children. She's a girl boss. She's got her own business. I would want to be Marlene if it wasn't for the horrible way that she died. You know how she died, Mike?
How did she die? Well, I know how she died, but what's the pun?
She shattered a glass ceiling.
Oh, I love that. Very good.
She shattered a glass. Did she girl boss too hard?
She shattered a glass.
And she shattered.
Well, totally. I mean, here we have the independent. This is like you talked about this kind of backlash to second wave feminism, right?
Yeah.
Here we have the career woman who is the only one, I think, brutally murdered in the whole film.
Yeah, the only one brutally murdered, and who is trying to like break the glass ceiling, but then the glass ceiling breaks her literally. That is how she dies.
That is great.
So I think this film is pretty clever for these reasons. I think it is aware of what it's doing with its like female cast, and also like if this film with a lesser cast would be so boring.
Yes.
But everyone does their job really well. Like Annabella Sciorra, she does a really good job of like being quite warm, a little bit dippy sometimes, but you kind of like her. Like she's a bit boring, but you kind of like her.
Absolutely. Like you're right. There's not much to the character. It's only because of the strength of the performances that you really give a shit about a lot of these characters. Because you're right. It's a kind of slow burn film too, right? It's like little tiny insidious things. There's no big horror until the last like half hour, right? But until then, it's like, oh, I moved your inhaler, or I dropped this earring in the cradle, and it's like these little things that build up and snowball, isn't it? Yeah.
And it does kind of play into this stereotype, which I think is really harmful, but that, you know, men express their anger and women are clever and like subversive in their anger. Like this is something I used to hear a lot when I was younger. Like girls are, you know, boys will beat you up, but girls will like ruin your life.
Right.
Like, it kind of feels like that in a nutshell.
Yes, this and Single White Female do have elements of that, don't they, actually? Like, girls are sneakier. And the guys in these films are pretty dumb, to be fair, aren't they?
Oh, they don't even need to be there. I mean, Michael is just there to, like, earn the money. Yeah. And he's not even very good at that because he has that proposal that he needs to mail by a certain date, gives it to his wife, who is very busy juggling a greenhouse, a baby, all sort of.
And then he gets really passive aggressive with her about it when she didn't manage to put, like, if it's something that important, do it
mail
yourself.
It yourself.
Yeah.
Also, does like, I don't know how the mail works because like I'm a millennial, but like, can't you just like mail it the next day? Because obviously if you mail it then it's going to take a while to get there anyway. So can't you just like mail it in, give them a call, be like, hey,
it's not
my dog ate my homework.
Yeah, it's not there yet. Exactly.
Anyway, it doesn't matter because Michael doesn't matter. He's just there for the money.
Let's talk about Solomon for a minute, right? So this is a slightly trickier thing, and I think this is something that has like dated quite badly. You mentioned earlier there are some pretty bad stereotypes in this, and I think this character of Solomon, played by Ernie Hudson, is a difficult one. Like, I think this is one that kind of feels like it sort of dates the movie in that regard, right? It feels a little bit caricaturish in a way.
It's terrible. It's terrible. The only way I can stomach it is by looking at it as a commentary on the hypocrisy of these white suburban families. So Solomon is this character, oh God, even describing him is painful, but he is sent over to the house from this company that gives people with mental health issues work. So he comes over as a handyman. His introduction is basically he comes up to the house while Claire is inside in the kitchen, and he doesn't know, like he can't find the front door, and Claire spots him from the window and screams and runs to her husband, who goes out and grabs him by the lapels, and he's like, what the fuck are you doing? You know, on my property. And then Solomon explains that, oh, I'm your handyman, you're expecting me. And honestly. Yeah. And then contrast that with the way that Peyton is introduced. Peyton also walks off the street, unexpected. actually unexpected. Like, Solomon had an appointment. Peyton, because she's a pretty blonde woman, walks off the street unexpected, gets invited for dinner, but Solomon gets like manhandled by her boring white husband.
It's got to be in some way commenting on that, right? I mean, the fact that they trust the pretty white woman who turns out to be the real villain. They don't trust the black man on their property, who actually turns out to be the best human being in the whole film, probably, right? But that being said, that's all well and good, but the way, I don't know, there's something a bit patronizing, I think, isn't there, about the way this character is treated.
Yeah, no, the reason that I don't actually think that this film is aware of how it's treating its one black character is because of the rest of the film, where he, like, his character is supposed to be someone who struggles, who has like a mental illness of some sort. It's not specified, but it presents itself as him just being a bit slow, which is very
and a bit childlike, right?
Infantilizing.
Do you know what I think of? I think of like Lenny from Of Mice and Men. He's got like that vibe about him, basically.
Yeah, or the guy from the Green Mile.
Yes.
You know, just this large black man who is like very good but like infantilized. Like he doesn't have his own desires or wants. He's just there to like do work and be innocent. Then so the treatment of him and the treatment of his mental illness is not very good at all. And he also, like, he's definitely this archetype that we talked about before, this very harmful archetype, which is quote unquote the magical Negro, who is just this character who is simply there to be there for the aid of the white characters, often white children, which he absolutely is. Like, he has a connection with the little girl, which Peyton eventually weaponizes later on, really grossly. He's a stereotype. And also, he has no wants or desires of his own. And can we talk about the end now? Like,
yeah, let's, yeah, absolutely.
He gets kicked off the property because Peyton basically frames him for assaulting the little girl. And then for some reason, Solomon, he just hangs around the house, kind of like watching over the family, because he's the only one who realizes what Peyton's really like. And then at the end, he's the one who comes in out of nowhere and just rescues them. Yeah. He's done nothing. He has nothing else to do, according to this film.
Yeah. Ernie Hudson does what he can. And I feel for Ernie Hudson, because he you know, I feel like he always got these kind of like bit parts or stereotypes to play in through a lot of his career, especially at the time. And he's spoken out about, you know, like the ghost. He was like the fourth Ghostbuster, right? Who didn't get any screen time compared to the other three and all of that kind of thing. And it is just an archetype. It's a stereotype, but that's literally all he is, isn't he? Like you said, we don't find out anything about him, about what is actually wrong with him, this mental illness, this kind of generic mental illness that he has, about his life, about anything other than that he's there to assist this family.
Yeah, he's a Deus Ex Machina at the end.
To assist this family. Yeah, exactly, yeah. So, yeah, not great. And it is strange. It's really interesting and weird how this film does feel like Single White Female, we've already talked about, as being so 90s. This film actually feels older.
Yeah, 50s. Yeah, it feels like a Douglas Sirk film, maybe.
You're absolutely right. That is how it feels. It feels exactly like a Douglas Sirk film. And some of that's got to be deliberate, I think. But it's interestingly dated in that way.
It is,
yeah,
and
it's
I think
weird.
there was a lot of that happening in like wider pop culture at the time. There was definitely a callback like to the good old days, quote unquote, of the pre-feminism, civil rights kind of peace order of this imagined world that they had in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. There was the return in the early 90s of the screwball comedy too, where we got films like Father of the Bride and those kind of things, right? This kind of return to this like heyday of 30s and 40s romances. Even
those like the rom-coms of the 90s, I do love them, but they are also all a throwback. Like I'm thinking of My Best Friend's Wedding, which is a screwball comedy.
Absolutely.
It's basically a Philadelphia Story.
Yes. You've got Mail, which is the book, the shop around the corner, right? It's literally a remake of a 40s screwball comedy as well, where actually You've Got Mail is actually a pretty grim story where this guy just gaslights this woman throughout the whole film. Right? Yeah.
Oh man, gaslighting officially the scariest plot device.
Yes, I know. Yeah. It's really strange, isn't it? Having said all that, again, I think it's possible that two things can be true at once, and this film does have flaws and it does have issues, but I still think it kind of like it's quite a fun time, and it really it moves along at a pace. I think that the like you said, the performances kind of really carry it, and then I think it's got a great final act. Like, what do you think of the actual horror stuff itself in this film? You know, mad Rebecca De Mornay at the end, like attacking the children and everything else.
I love it. I love it when I love films where a woman just gets to go completely mad and destroy a house.
Yes.
Like there was this great Elizabeth Taylor film. I can't remember the name. It's like where she like moves to London and she just at the end she's just like breaking all the windows and like murdering people. I just love it. And I thought that Rebecca De Mornay was excellent. Like she just goes full hog. She just completely throws herself around and yeah, I love a film where like a boring house gets just like a big boring like family home just gets destroyed. I'm like, who's going to clean that up? Yeah. Everything in the house becomes a weapon.
Yeah,
that's the one thing that, you know, like sometimes I walk around, I'm just like, what in this room can be used as a weapon if I need it? That camera's got corners that, you know.
Yes, exactly. A lamp. I can see a lamp behind you there. You could smash that over somebody.
Oh, yeah, that lampshade. I could take that off, use it. You know, it's heavy.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so it goes completely bonkers. And obviously, like, it resolves itself in the most stupid way. And the very, very, very final shot, which is just on that house, which is just like, yeah, everything's okay now. The intended order has been restored. The family's all fine. Don't worry. Oh, also another thing where I thought like this one was actually quite clever. Rebecca De Mornay's character, Peyton, Mrs. Mott, she dies by being impaled by a white picket fence.
A white picket fence, yes.
So this film, it loves its metaphors.
I agree. I love that too. I love that she's killed by the white picket fence on the perfectly pruned lawn. You know, it's perfect.
Which Solomon built as well.
Yes, that's a good point.
Yeah, so thank you, Solomon.
Yeah, thank you, Solomon. Interesting. What an interesting film, right? How do you think it holds up? You know, it's 30 years old now. How do you find it watching it today? Is this still a film that you'd recommend to people?
I would, because I think it's a really interesting snapshot of that point in time where there was definitely a pushback. There was definitely this idea that like feminism is done. We don't need it anymore. There was this kind of like acceptance of choice feminism where people argued that feminism was about giving women the choice of going to work or staying at home, and some women choose to stay at home. And this is definitely like Claire's choice. Like it validates that choice.
Yes.
And it's very of its time. I think with any film that is a good snapshot of its time, there's going to be moments that are very uncomfortable, like the treatment of Solomon.
Yeah.
And like the fact that, you know, no one, just like Mrs. Peyton's motivation doesn't make sense.
Absolutely none. Like what she basically, I suppose you're right. Like the basically all we know about her, what defines her character is that she's lost her husband, child, and home, and she's come to steal someone else's. Basically, she blames Claire for her losing her house, child, and home. So therefore, she wants Claire's, doesn't she? Essentially,
it's definitely like a woman feels like written by a man kind of character. So I would recommend it to people. I think, you know, just recommend it, but then say it was made in 1992.
Yes, just take that with a pinch of salt. Absolutely. Well, there you go. That is The Hand That Rocks the Cradle from 1992. Hello everyone, just interrupting this week's discussion momentarily to thank this week's sponsor. That's $20 Patreon subscriber, Jared Hornbeck. Jared sent me a little message to say, hello Mike, my name is Jared and I'm one of the co-hosts of a new Full Moon Features podcast called Puppet Masters / Castle Freaks, which does a deep dive into every film in the low budget Charles Band universe, or Bandiverse. If you're a fan of full moon features of the work of low-budget mogul Charles Band, you're going to want to check out our new weekly podcast, Puppet Masters/Castle Freaks. Each week, hosts Jared and Steve, and often a guest, will sit down for a witty, informative, and entertaining look at a different full moon adjacent movie and give them the attention they feel they rightly deserve. If you're a fan of low-budget horror or Charles Band's catalogue specifically, you should definitely check out the show, as there are very few others like it out there. So far, they've featured episodes on The Puppet Master, Subspecies, Robot Jocks, Evil Bong, Piranha Woman, Trancers, Oblivion, and others. Episodes in the near future involve sorority babes in the Slimeball Bowl-orama, From Beyond, Tourist Trap, Dolls, Meridian, and Demonic Toys, among others. Once again, that show is Puppet Master/Castle Freaks, the truly definitive full moon features podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts. That sounds great. Thank you so much, Jared. One more time, a huge thank you to this week's sponsor, $20 Patreon subscriber and host of the Puppet Masters and Castle Freaks podcast, Jared Hornbeck. And if you want to get your own dedicated segment in the middle of an episode, just like Jared here, where you can plug your own podcast or your own blog, or just send me a message to read out. It can literally contain anything you like. Just send me a message and I will read it. Sign up at a $20 level on Patreon, patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's episode as Maha Albadrawi and I move on to another banger from 1992. This is Single White Female.
In this city, on this street, in this apartment.
Hi, are you Allison Jones? I'm Hedra Carlson.
Hedra? That's unusual. When can you move in?
An ad for a roommate brought a stranger into Allison's life. Someone
Beautiful on you.
who shares.
Well, it's kind of fun having a girlfriend again.
Someone
Do you guys know when you'll be back?
No, it's kind of an anniversary tonight.
Really?
who cares.
Where the hell have you been?
Making me feel like I'm 16 years old here.
Someone who borrows.
I've got a surprise for you.
You've got to be kidding.
I love myself like this.
It was like looking at myself. It was scary.
Someone who steals.
Hey, sleepy guy.
Allie?
No, not Allie.
Someone who would kill to be her.
Possible bloodstains.
You gotta help me, Grim.
She's a lunatic, Allie.
She needs me.
How do you lock the terror out
Don't let me come get you!
when you've already invited it in?
Look at me!
New York, 1992. Pre-Rudy Giuliani. Rent-controlled apartments. We're in the Ansonia, which is this big, beautiful, like, I don't know, maybe 1890s building with like brass, moldings. And I don't really know how to describe windows, but, like those, those big swirly things.
Yes.
And, high ceilings, big, beautiful windows, floor to ceiling. And also we've got our heroine or anti-heroine, I don't know, Allie. She has got main character syndrome big time. Allie doesn't give a fuck about anyone else. But, she's our heroine. We like her. She's got this great cropped red haircut. She's a tech girl. And she basically finds out that her boring boyfriend, what's his name? Sam. Let's call him Sam. He has cheated on her with his ex-wife, I think. And then, so she kicks him out. And because Allie has big time main character syndrome and is afraid of being alone in her big, beautiful rent-controlled apartment, she decides to get a roommate, and she wants a girl roommate. She thinks it'll be fun. Mm-hmm. And so she gets a roommate, and of this like crop of roommates that she's interviewing, in walks Hetty, who is again a white woman who comes in with no background, nothing, just sort of like hits it off with our main character and is invited to live with her immediately, which is a bad idea. As someone who's lived with flatmates, sleep on it. sleep on it.
Check some references, think about it for a moment. Yeah.
And then, unfortunately, it turns out that Hetty, this is also bad. Like, Hetty has some mental health issues, which is treated in a very 90s way. And Hetty basically becomes obsessed with Allie and tries to sort of take over her life.
Indeed. So, Maha, what is it about this movie particularly? I mean, actually, I think back, months ago when I announced I was doing this series, you actually asked me and you were like, can I talk about single white female? What is it about this movie that kind of really strikes a chord with you?
I think this film is so beautifully shot. Like, everything in this film is beautiful and well thought out. The apartment is like a character in itself. So what we know about this apartment is that it's in the Ansonia Hotel, which is like this old building in New York. It's kind of like the inspiration behind the building in Only Murders in the Building.
Yes. Do you know what? I didn't know that, but that is exactly what I thought about when rewatching this. Yeah.
And in that show, that building is like full of rich people. In this era, early 90s New York, it's like basically a bunch of artists, we're led to believe. It's rent controlled, and there is something very gothic. The way that the light shines through the windows and hits the walls, it reminds me of like Michael Curtiz. It reminds me of like Casablanca, the way that the shadows on the walls create these beautiful shapes. And they create shadows like on the characters' faces. It's shot like a film noir. That's what I love about this film. And I think the thing about film noir is that it was, people say that now that it expresses these post-war anxieties that men had. I feel like this is a 90s noir. I feel like this is a 90s noir, and it expresses another kind of wave of anxiety that people had about women living alone in the city.
Yeah.
Maybe anxieties that women had themselves about living alone in the city, while they were also supposed to be like these badass feminists who, didn't need no man.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that this is another film that's elevated by the performances. I think Bridget Fonda I miss her. I think she is an actress that is so underrated and, unjustly forgotten.
Yeah, agreed.
If we're talking about Nepo babies as well, let's talk about one of the best Nepo babies, Bridget Fonda, who definitely inherited her family's talent. She's got such an interesting screen presence. She looks like a statue.
Yes.
She's
beautiful and she's brilliant. I completely agree with you. And this is something I've talked about in the last couple of weeks. There are a handful of actresses from this era that I feel we've never seen again since this era. I mean, Sharon Stone is a classic one, but then you've also got people like Linda Fiorentino from The Last Seduction, and you've got people like Jean Triplehorn, and these actresses that
had a moment.
Sadly, really had a moment, and then never got to do more stuff after that for whatever reason.
All of those actresses made a real impression on me because I was about 8 or 9, at the end of the 90s, and all these films, probably because of their kind of release schedules, they were beginning to appear on TV in New Zealand.
Yeah.
So I got to see a lot of them, probably when I wasn't supposed to, late at night. So it was my first exposition to womanhood, adult womanhood.
Yeah.
So when I was picturing myself as an adult, I was definitely picturing myself more like Linda Fiorentino.
Yeah.
Oh God, that sounds weird, right?
No, everyone has people like that, don't they? When they're young and they watch them in films.
Yeah. Or definitely as Bridget Fonda in this big, beautiful apartment in a city, running my own business.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's quite a striking film. The way it looks, the performances in it. It's also pre-Rudy Giuliani New York, is I think made in 1991, 1992. So you get to see this New York that's still quite grimy. That's just before the first big wave of gentrification hits those areas. It's not Manhattan. It's another part of New York. I don't know where, but it's not Bright Lights, Big City.
Yes. It's not like Sex and the City, New York, is it?
No.
Yeah.
It's just before that. And the building, the architecture and the spaces, the way the building is choreographed is really, really, really well done. Just that screwdriver that makes makes the lift work.
Yes.
That feels like a real apartment that someone's lived in.
Yes.
Yeah.
I completely agree with everything you've just said. Like, for whatever reason, this film is not one that I've, like, gone back to much. I saw it as a kid. I had two older sisters who used to watch all of these films so I got quite exposed to these films quite young. And for whatever reason, I kind of, like, was never that big a fan of this one. And rewatching it this week, I was like, wow, this actually is really good. Like, the story's great. Again, it kind of moves along at quite a pace. The performances are amazing. And I agree with everything you said about the way this film is directed and looks. It looks beautiful. I think compared to all of these other movies from this era that are sort of a bit generic looking, and sometimes that's part of it. Like we've talked about, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle has this like 1950s gloss to it almost. This is just so much more interesting. It's like shadowy and steely, and it almost looks a bit like, it reminds me of something like The Hunger or something. Like it has this kind of like cool, quite chilly aesthetic, I think, which I really like.
Moody.
Yeah.
And you just see people looking at the way that they look at things and through things. There's a bit of voyeurism in it, which I always found really interesting. When I was younger and I watched this film, I was like, oh, this is like really dirty. It feels like something I'm not supposed to watch. But now I feel like, they sort of like hint at voyeurism and the pleasure of like watching something you're not really supposed to. But then it doesn't really lean into it. It's kind of just sort of like lets it go. Like when Allie walks in and she sees Hetty masturbating in bed.
Yes.
And then she just sort of walks off. I feel like that was, I'm still not sure what that was hinting at or what it was telling us. It was definitely suggesting that these women love looking at each other. They're quite drawn to each other.
Absolutely.
But then it just sort of lets it go, and it brings boring old Sam into the picture, who is just there to be killed.
Yeah, there's definitely another version of this movie, right, where these two, there is something that happens between these two. I feel like a version of this movie made now would maybe play on that a little bit more, probably, Yeah, that is an interesting moment, that bit when she's masturbating, because the eroticism in this movie is kind of quite fleeting and sometimes quite strange. Like the moment when she follows her Hetty into that club.
The sort of leather club?
Is it a kind of kink fetish club or something? Like it...
I feel like that was a very reductive, basically, like signal of just saying, like, oh yeah, Allie's twisted.
Yeah, right.
Like Allie's weird because she goes into sex clubs, because this is also like a very kink-shamey time. The early 90s, when also this is like was like right in the middle of the AIDS crisis.
Yes.
So there was definitely this pushback against like expressing your sexuality, very like abstinence era, like sex is dangerous. So Hetty going into a kink club, I guess is supposed to signal that she's craven in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That she's a deviant or something,
that she's
right?
Yes,
but also that scene is so brief that you're like, hang on, what just happened? Like she steps into that club and we're in that scene for about 2 minutes before it cuts. Yeah. And again, I wonder whether stuff was cut there. Like I feel like maybe
I think so.
There should have been more to that scene. It was really strange. Yeah.
I didn't look into this, but I wonder what rating this film had. Was it NC-17 or was it?
I'm sure it probably wasn't. I reckon it was cut to get an R. Like I would have thought. I think so. Right.
That feels like. To me, that sounds like something like a fight between the director, Barbe Schroeder, and the studio, he was just like, you know what, I will cut what I need to, but I'm leaving this in.
Yes.
And I'm kind of glad that it is left in, because it makes me, I feel like this is one of those scenes that makes me wonder about this film, like wonder about what it's suggesting and what's going on beneath the surface.
Yeah.
I think maybe that's why this film stuck with me, is that it suggests a lot, but it's not very explicit.
I agree.
I mean, it can be explicit, but like it doesn't go in as much as it could.
No, I agree. And I think there's something I think she's a really great villain. She's a bit more... It's still a little bit of a dated, mental illness portrayal, of course.
Reductive,
it's a bit reductive, but I still think she's actually a more interesting character than, for example, Rebecca De Mornay's Peyton. I think, her kind of... she sort of wants to protect Ali, but then also kind of wants to destroy her at the same time. And there's something kind of interesting, I think, about that, and about like the really interesting dynamics of the end, the big final act where they're kind of, she's tied her up and there's this and there's that and all the scuffles. And then the moment when the one person that comes to save her is the rapist, right? Is the horrible boss that sexually assaulted her. And that is a really interesting scene because I'm like, oh, what's going to happen now? Is Hedy going to want to save her from this guy? Is he going to protect her? Is he actually more dangerous than Hedy is? Like, and I found all that really interesting, right? That's who poor Ali ends up, stuck with by that final act,
Yeah, I found that a really, really interesting little set piece as well. And because that's all set off because Ali, despite the fact that she is maybe not the best businesswoman, she sets that lock on her software that basically makes it all delete until he pays the bill, which I'm like,
Maha,
go Ali, girl bossing.
As a freelancer, do you not think that is the greatest thing you've ever seen? As somebody that has...
wish I could do that.
Honestly, as somebody that has really gotten into some very, very aggressive back and forth emails with employers recently about very, very late invoices, I would love to be able to do what she did there and just be like, nope, you haven't paid me. Fuck you then. I'm cutting off this product that I gave you,
My God. Can any tech whizzes out there, can you please build us a software for freelancers, for video freelancers specifically, that makes all of our videos disappear after a certain date and reappear after the invoice has been paid? I will support this, please.
I loved it. She's an icon and a hero, I think, Ali, for doing that. But yes, this guy played by Stephen Tobolowsky, who is clearly from the start this horrible boss who's underpaying her but then doesn't want to share her with other people and then sexually assaults her. To have him come in at the end to be the one that may or may not save her in this final showdown is a really kind of interesting, bold choice, I think, isn't it? I have felt different ways on different viewings about that scene. There have been times when I've just been like, this is a bad decision on the filmmaker's part. Yes, because is it forgiving him? Is it redeeming him or something? Yeah. But he does get killed. He does actually get killed. So is it actually kind of a really creative way of killing this guy? But then also that kind of makes Hedy hero? I don't know. It's not a hero. Nothing is clear in this film. No. I
kind of like that murkiness.
I do as well, because Hedy does do some cool stuff. Like the moment when she calls him at his home, that guy, and speaks to his wife and threatens him in order to protect Ali, you're kind of with her for a lot of the film almost, aren't you? And yes, she is sneaky and manipulative, and she is a bit gaslighty in the way that she tries to interfere with Ali's relationship with the boyfriend. But to be fair, the boyfriend's a bit of a dick too, and she's being a best friend who's looking out for Ali, right? Yeah, and when Ali, stays over at that guy's at the boyfriend's house and doesn't call Hedy, I was fully with Hedy there. I was like, this is New York, things happen. And you couldn't pick up the phone and just say, I'm staying over at Sam's tonight. Or, obviously you can text back then, but if you live with someone and they don't come home, that's scary. But that's also part of what I like about that is that they don't present Ali as this perfect heroine. She is very flawed. She definitely has main character syndrome, and those people are fucking annoying. You know, those people who think that you don't have a life and everything has to work around them. But that makes her interesting. That makes her watchable to me. Agreed. Do you think this was aimed at a different kind of demographic to The Hand That Rocks the Cradle? Again, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle is so about the kind of married life, the parenting life, the suburbia. Something about this feels a bit edgier and cooler and younger skewed to me, I think, Definitely. I feel like Hand That Rocks the Cradle was for the people who watched Fatal Attraction and cheered at the end. When the wife kills Glenn Close. Yes. And I feel like this one is definitely skewed maybe younger, maybe to people who haven't quite settled into the suburbs yet, or maybe I don't know, maybe it was aimed at people who had moved out into the suburbs and were a bit bored and wanted to see something a little bit racy, but not
that didn't lean fully into the dirty stuff.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It does really ride that line, I think, doesn't it, as so many of these movies do. What do you think of Jennifer Jason Leigh? I mean, we've spoken about Bridget Fonda. What do you think of Jennifer Jason Leigh as our villain, I suppose you'd call her, Hedy?
I think she's great. I think again, this is a movie where the performances are really elevate the kind of like not great script or or story. I feel like she's believable as this kind of girl who doesn't have a lot of confidence. And I think it was also really clever casting because I think they broadly kind of do look alike. So at the very beginning, when they've got different hairstyles and different clothing, they don't look anything alike. And then when Jennifer Jason Leigh gets that haircut, the first time I saw it when I was like quite a young girl, I was like, what the fuck? They're twins. But I know now they're not, but they look enough alike that I think that was quite a good casting decision. And I like how she is a different person around different people. Like she's quite very subtly flirty with Sam, very kind of like submissive and sweet around Allie, because I think she recognizes that Allie needs to be the alpha. And she, so she understands that to get what she wants, to get the relationship she wants from Allie, she needs to be the beta and Allie has to be the alpha. And just her physicality is great as well. Like when at the end, when she's very like agitated, she kind of like stops around and she's a completely different person. Like the way that she bumps into people in the streets. That's a different person to the person who walks in at the beginning of the film. I don't know. There's something different about her than there are to the villains in Fatal Attraction or Hand That Rocks the Cradle. Like there's more of a vulnerability to her, I think, isn't there? Like she's constantly scared and shaky and nervous at the same time as being quite aggressive and violent, and that is kind of interesting about her. And Jennifer Jason Leigh is really good at that. Like she's got this kind of like quietness about her in a lot of the films she's in. Like I'm thinking of films like Annihilation and Possessor recently as well, but there's something kind of sinister going on often with the roles she plays, even though she's quite quiet and subdued in all of them. She can be quite gruff as well. She can be very big. Like she's quite a small person, but she gives off like this big toughness. I don't really like this film, but did you watch Hateful Eight?
Yes. I didn't love that. I think it's my least favorite Tarantino film, but she's great in it. She's great. She brings out that side of her that really kind of scary like rough side of her, and I think we see hints of that here when she's obviously a lot younger, and I think also she plays, I think that both of them play that kind of like female friendship, like a slight obsessiveness that can sort of happen really, really well. That's something that I recognize. Like, sometimes you meet other women and you think they're so cool and you want to be their friend, and you just sort of become like, it's almost like a romance. Like you just fall in love with them, and like a platonic love is what I'm talking about. And then, and sometimes as well, you meet someone who's so cool, who you feel like is you if you had your shit together, right? And you're a little bit obsessed with them, and you're just like, they're I want to be their friend, but I also kind of want to destroy them and replace them. It's so interesting. I love that. It's so true, and that and I love that this film takes it to the extreme. That thing that all friends would have in that regard, where you look up to somebody, you want to be them, you start maybe trying to dress the same way as them, you start trying to act in the same way as them, right? Obviously, this movie takes it to extreme, and there's that brilliant moment when she gets the haircut, and it's just brilliant, isn't it? But I love it. I love that it kind of takes that very relatable thing, particularly with female friendships, I think, right? I mean, I think it exists in all friendships, but I think there is something about it, particularly about women and female friendships, right? And it takes that and brings it to that kind of horrific extreme, which I think is great. It's a very, and so much so, right, that single white female has become like a vernacular. It's like people say, oh, I've been single white femaled. It's like it's become a thing, a bit like Bunny Boiler with Fatal Attraction. Like it's entered the kind of it's entered the kind of the culture in a way that it's almost kind of transcended the film itself, you know?
Yeah, I think there's a song by there's a rap who's like, she single white femaled me, or
yeah, exactly. It's really interesting, and they tapped into something very real, I think, with that idea, didn't they? You know, yeah, it's very cool.
Now, Mike, as a Successionista, I expected you.
I know exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about the lovely neighbour that lives in the upstairs flat, right?
Yeah.
Whose character name is, let me find him. Graham, played by Peter Friedman. Now, I spent the first half of this film going, where do I know this guy from? He's kind of this, like, quite handsome, floppy-haired guy.
I thought maybe Sex and the City. I was like, was he on Sex and the City? Was he in, like, Caroline and the City?
Yes. I was like, clearly he is some character actor that's been in a lot of things, and I was trying to think, and then eventually I was like, oh my fucking God, it's Frank from Succession.
Frank! I know, and he is this film's reductive stereotype. He is a gay actor who lives above Ellie, who sort of, he's like her only friend.
He's the non-threatening, he's the only non-threatening man in the whole film as well.
I know. And the most beautiful apartment. I love both of these apartments. The real estate in this film, Mike, I don't even know.
Unbelievable.
I love both of them. I love them. I love Ellie's like minimalist, like beautiful swirly apartment, and I love his, which is like basically like Carrie's apartment in Sex and the City, which has got like floor to ceiling shelves full of books and like clothes, and he's got a cat.
Yeah.
How is he affording this?
I mean, how is anyone affording any of this?
I don't know. That's a boring question. I should
know.
stop asking it. But like, it's but yeah, like.
Do you know what?
I couldn't believe it.
Not to go off on a tangent about this, but I only started thinking about that recently with Sex and the City. I was never really a Sex and the City watcher. But am I right in thinking that Carrie Bradshaw pays for like a really big apartment in Manhattan by just writing one column per week?
Yes, Mike, that is what freelancing is like. It's definitely not me staying up until 4 a.m. regularly, trying to hit a deadline and thinking one day it's going to pay off. And
then chasing an invoice for about £100 maybe.
Oh
and
God,
that is, and yet somehow she's able to afford like Gucci and everything else that she has in her life. But anyway, that's a different conversation.
It's
a fantasy, and it ties in with that 90s Friends too, right? Like, I know everyone talks about that with the TV show Friends. The 90s was full of that, wasn't it? Where it's like, how are people affording this lifestyle? But it doesn't matter. It's a fantasy. That's the point of it.
It's a fantasy. And you know what? You just need 2 minutes out into in the real world to think like, well, that's not how things work. I'm going to have to like make a plan for this, or maybe like temper my expectations.
Yeah, I love it. So yeah, I mean, how do you find the horror in this movie in comparison to The Hand That Rocks the Cradle as well, and the way that the horror kind of cranks up towards its final act?
I find this one a lot more scary because I find it a bit more relatable, for one thing, because, I'm sure you have as well. Like, we've all lived with flatmates and, had these situations where you're just like, oh my God, who am I living with? And
absolutely. And
then the other thing is that I find that the horror in this is really subtle, and it builds quite, slowly, and to the point where it kind of goes a bit bonkers at the end, but bonkers in a way that weirdly makes sense. Like when Allie trying to fight back constantly, and the little thing she does, like kicking the wallet aside so that so that she knows that Hetty would go look for it, and then she can like use her internet skills to call for help. That going wrong is brilliant. Like I love it. Like it's terrifying.
It's great. I love this device. We talked about this with Misery a couple of weeks ago. Another great, dangerous, psychotic woman movie in a house, right? But every single attempt that James Caan's character makes to escape keeps being thwarted. He keeps being outsmarted, and it's both really frustrating and scary, and also really fun, to like keep watching this play out. And yeah, I agree with you. The last act of this film is actually quite long.
Yeah,
it's like the last third of the movie, right? From when she's tied up in the chair to turning up the volume to then trying to escape to trying to call for help via 90s computer to everything that then happens in the basement and her hiding in the vent and all of that. Like, it really goes on, doesn't it?
It really does. Yeah. They really use the build. They use every room that is introduced in this film really well. Like because I think part of it happens in Graham's apartments as well, right?
Yes,
so,
it does.
Like everything that's set up is paid off. And I think that is a really underrated skill in filmmaking, having something that's set up actually eventually paying off later on. And also like, I love that it starts off with Ellie kind of like having this creeping suspicion that something is off, and that just slowly getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And she's sort of like, she almost makes it out, but she's always just one step behind Hetty. I do wonder as well with, that opening shot of the two twin girls. That felt like something that was tacked on at the end.
Yes.
Because I don't need that shot.
Well, I don't know the specifics of what happened, but I do know that similarly to Fatal Attraction, that after test screenings, they had to reshoot some of the ending of the film.
Yeah.
And I don't know exactly. I haven't been able to find information on what exactly was reshot and what was changed. But yes, there is definitely a feeling that moment is tacked on.
Yeah, it was very like Basil exposition. It was like, there's going to be something about twinning here. Whereas I think without that, you could that revelation at the end that Ellie was a twin. Sorry, that Hetty was a twin. Still works really well because there's a lot of like doubling shots. There's a lot of like hints at doubles mirroring in this film throughout, which again is like that very skilled filmmaking by Barbet Schroeder.
Very good. It harks back to movies like Persona, Ingmar Bergman, or like to what would be, Vertigo. Of course, Mulholland Drive. There is a feeling of that as well. But I completely agree. I love all of that stuff. Now, what is exactly her MO here? Like, we talked about how this wasn't completely clear with The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. So, am I right in thinking, so Hetty's backstory is that she was a twin, the twin died, she was kind of blamed for her twin's death, and has since, or did she kill her twin? And she has since been sort of trying to replace and find a new best friend / twin sister who she can protect / control or something. Like, is that kind of how you read it?
I can't decide. I have watched this film a few times and I can't decide whether Hetty was blamed or just traumatized and blamed herself for the death of her twin, because her dad calls at the end and he wants her to come home and, they want to take care of her. So I think that's I don't think that she was blamed. I think she blamed herself. So I think, there is a little bit of like trauma there from her. And she's definitely, I don't think she's aware that she was trying to replace her twin. I think she walks into Ellie's apartment thinking, I'm going to start a new life.
Absolutely.
And then her psychosis, whatever it is, slowly takes over. I think it's a progression. I don't think she went in thinking, I want this girl to be my twin.
Completely agree with you. Completely agree. And I think that's why the film is paced really well in that regard, I think. Like, it really kind of, it steers us on that trajectory of, like you say, things starting off kind of like small and subtle and sinister, like, oh, that's strange, she's got the same outfit or whatever it might be, to like full on, I'm trying to stab you to death. And I by the way, I love some of the brutal moments towards the end, like when she's trapping her in the lift doors, her arms in the lift, the slidey lift and stuff. I'm like,
visceral.
Could really feel that,
Yeah, it's very crunchy, like it feels real. And also, like, this film gives new meaning to the term killer heels.
Oh, that's a great moment as well, isn't it? Yeah.
That was the moment that when I was a kid, like, gave me nightmares.
Absolutely.
Being killed by a heel. I don't think that would actually kill someone, but that doesn't matter. It was done so well. It was, we'll put that up with the rent.
That whole scene is a very disturbing / confusing scene to watch, especially when you're young, because I'm like, so she's giving him a blowjob, she's pretending to be the other girl, but then he realizes it's her, but then he ejaculates, like, and then like it gets so fucked up from there, right? But I'm like, I love that whole sequence. Again, it's pretty bold. It's great.
It's very bold. Yeah. It's just like bringing in her attacker to save her. It's very bold, and I don't feel great about it, but I'm also like, I'm okay with feeling uncomfortable with films. I think that,
Absolutely.
it's just part of being a grown up, because your other option's fucking Marvel films.
Exactly. Give me some weird,
Boring, yeah.
murky
Make me
morality.
feel weird.
Yeah, make me feel weird. Absolutely. And this movie does that. It really does that. And I really appreciated that on this particular watch. Like, there was a lot more to it than I initially remembered, I think. And it is a really interesting film in that regard. Yeah.
I think that when I first watched it when I was a kid, this was at a time when my English wasn't very good. So I think I was mostly struck by the visuals. So I kind of understood what was going on based on how it looked and how it was shot. So the visual language of this film is very clear, very thought out.
Yes, absolutely.
Like, the older I get, the more I find about it that's interesting.
Yeah.
Also, did you notice that there are no real crowd scenes in this film, which I think is a really striking choice? Like, there's that scene at the end of a party when Allie goes to her employer, her creepy boss's store, and they've just had a party, but the party's over and everyone's left.
Yes. Yeah, you're so right.
There's something about that. I'm not sure what it is, but I think there's something really striking about the fact that all of the shots in this film basically have maximum 3 people in them, apart from when Hetty lines up to cash her check. That's it.
You're so
Everything
right.
else is just 2 people.
That's such an interesting point, and I think you're right. Like, that is a very interesting, deliberate thing, probably, that is partly works for the plot, because partly there is that element of, Hetty says, nobody's seen me. Like, nobody knows I exist, right? So that's something.
Oh, when she said that.
It's great, right? That's a really great moment, because you think about it and you're like, oh yeah, the doorman hasn't really noticed her. He thinks she's Allie, and everyone else that knows her is dead, right? So there is that. It works plot-wise, but I think it works thematically too, as this feeling of like being very alone and isolated in a busy city, potentially, and actually it not being as safe and filled with people as you might want, as well. And that is kind of interesting.
Not feeling like you can turn to people for help.
Yeah, and those big, steely, empty spaces, again, like the big, empty apartment that's so vast. And you're right, like the big open plan offices where she works and no one in them. Yeah, it's really true. It's really interesting. Yeah. Again, the only other scene with lots of people, the weird kink club that we only see for like a minute and a half. But again, like that's such a strange, bizarre moment that you...
Yeah, that almost feels out of place, but I think I feel like it was there just to like make a weird early 90s point about Hetty's inner depravity.
Yes, 100%. Well, there you go. Well, we're going to wrap up on this shortly, Maha. But first of all, let's head on over to this week's Wild About Horror segment, because psychoanalyst and Freudian cinephile Mary Wild has plenty of thoughts on Single White Female.
Hey Mike, Mary Wild here, with some thoughts on the 1992 psychological erotic thriller film, Single White Female. Having recently split from her fiancé Sam, software designer Allie welcomes Hetty as a flatmate in her beautiful New York City apartment. The young women quickly form a bond, but after Allie reconciles with her ex, she finds strange patterns of behavior in her new tenant. Hetty becomes jealous and hostile, even resorting to violence in her efforts to get Sam out of the picture. Meanwhile, Allie learns troubling information about Hetty's past and identity. Let's consider the beautiful Ansonia apartment building where much of the film's action takes place. It's a location where a lot of uncanny doubling occurs, a site where the ontological security of the main occupant, Allison Jones, is tested repeatedly. The drama begins when Allie learns that her fiancé Sam had an intimate encounter with his ex-wife Lisa earlier that day. Lisa is never shown. We only hear her tense voice on the answering machine. She comes to symbolize a painful replication, a second option attracting Sam's erotic interest, which Allie understandably resents because it is situated outside of herself. Another avenue for doubling occurs when Allie attends a business lunch with Mitchell Meyerson, a fashion house owner looking to buy her revolutionary new software application. He mentioned something about her disgruntled former business partner, but Ali explains that she did all the work to create the program, and the old colleague tried to take credit. The anguish of one's labor being co-opted and passed off as someone else's is an upsetting brand of doubling that appears in other horror films such as Darren Aronofsky's modern classic Black Swan and Daniel Goldhaber's Netflix sensation Cam. Unwilling to live alone, Ali advertises for a new flatmate to share her Upper West Side apartment. She settles on Hedra Carlson, whom she nicknames Hedy, and they become friends. Hedy says that her twin sister was stillborn, leaving her constantly lonely. There's an idea here linked with phantom pain, a perception that an individual has, relating to a limb or an organ that is not physically part of the body, either because it was removed or was never there in the first place. The absent sister indicates that an essential part of Hedy is missing. It becomes a tangible loss, and the specter of it haunts her. Hedy becomes overly protective of Ali, erasing Sam's voicemail and intercepting his letter asking Ali to reconcile with him. She becomes envious when Sam wins Ali back, and they search for a new apartment to live in on their own. Perceiving Ali as having rejected her, Hedy becomes distraught, and her frustration grows to worryingly irrational levels. At a beauty salon, Hedy appears dressed exactly like Ali, with the same haircut and red coloring. The shot of Hedy's transformation as she descends the salon stairs in slow motion, smiling and looking like Ali's long-lost identical twin sister, is iconic and terrifying. That night, Ali follows Hedy to a sex club and witnesses her masquerading as herself. This is what gets Hedy off, cosplaying as Ali. The identity theft is erotically charged. Ali finds a shoebox containing letters addressed to Ellen Besh, Hedy's real name, along with a newspaper clipping on the accidental drowning of Hedy's twin sister Judy when she was 9 years old. Apparently, Hedy suffers from survivor's guilt following the tragic childhood incident. I think that what animates her is a concept that Freud called secondary identification, which occurs following the removal of a cherished object. A common expression of this is wearing the clothes of a deceased loved one, or deliberately embodying aspects of a lost love. In these examples, the subject unconsciously seeks out current circumstances to replicate feelings of inferiority associated with the original event of bereavement. This serves to establish an identification of the ego with the lost object. The character of Hedy has been cited many times as an example of the borderline personality disorder known as BPD. She suffers from a vividly troubled sense of identity and tries to remedy it by adopting the wholesome attributes of her flatmate. BPD is a long-term pattern of abnormal behavior typified by volatile relationships with other people, an unstable sense of self, and dysregulated emotions. The BPD profile often features an extreme fear of abandonment, frequent reckless or dangerous behavior, a debilitating feeling of emptiness, and self-harm. Symptoms may be brought on by seemingly normal events. Substance abuse, depression, and eating disorders are commonly associated with BPD. The borderline structure has a lot to do with having difficulty defining clear traits of the self. It is a personality predicated on identity fragmentation, as if the self is hollowed out or gradually disappearing. In this context, the subject looks at personal relationships as opportunities to load themselves up with the characteristics of someone they are fond of. Fear of abandonment is out of proportion in BPD because the sufferer fills themselves up so much with someone they idealize that if the other person went away, then who are they? The externalized ideal becomes pathologically integral to their own identity, and so it is common for someone with BPD to develop an obsession with the person they become attached to. Ali and Hedy bond by spending time together, fleeting through each other's rooms, borrowing clothes, perfume, and jewelry. It becomes a bridge where they connect. They experience each other's realities through shared objects and spaces. The dramatic shift occurs when Ali and her ex Sam patch things up and reinstate their engagement to be married. The romantic reconciliation activates Hedy's dreaded outcome. She becomes the third wheel that must be banished from the relational dynamic. This is a classic representation of the experiential reality of BPD. Because the person forming the attachment has a limited sense of their own self, they rely completely on the person they love to inform the parameters of identity. Their worst fear is to be cast out of the bond and lose the emotional lifeline to survive and stay afloat. Sure enough, Hedy doesn't know what her personal tastes are. She's sort of a blank slate with no individual fashion sense, admitting to being clueless about what looks good. Not knowing what she values causes her to feel adrift, dissociated, and derealized. Hedy admires Ali's sartorial style and, like a sponge, absorbs everything Ali does, buying similar outfits and copying the same haircut. Hedy searches for women she admires and then fills herself up with their characteristics. This relieves her markedly disturbed identity in the short term, but it's an untenable solution that eventually leads to a more fragile mental state. The pathological feature is the desperate measures taken by borderline sufferers that intrude on the boundaries of the people they idealize, including stalking, manipulating, and sometimes committing violent acts. These excessive reactions occur out of fear because if they lose that person they adore, they live with the agony of potentially losing themselves. The software application Ali designs, where different fashion items are overlaid and superimposed on electronic models, follows the logic of the borderline structure because it involves quickly trying things on, experimenting with different styles at a rapid rate, and if something feels like a good fit, then it's favored and latched onto with a sense of urgency. The scene where Hedy sneaks into Sam's hotel room is fascinating because of the live-action role-play dimension, also known as LARPing. Hedy impersonates Ali. She wears Ali's clothes and perfume, sports Ali's hairdo. It's a Hedy mix of similar features as she slips into Sam's bed, making him believe momentarily that she's his fiancée, setting him up to repeat his earlier cheating transgression. Hedy proceeds to perform oral sex on Sam, an act that aligns rather neatly with the borderline condition, in which she drinks him in, the vital thing being the absorption into the self of the desired other. Sam is caught in a fog of confusion, apparently unsure of who's giving him head, an almost humorous reference to earlier on in the flatmate application scene, when Hedra Carlson joked about the names she got called at school on account of her unusual name. My concluding observation is to evoke that, midway in the film, in the scene where Ali gently snoops in Hedy's room, browsing personal objects like journals and jewelry, She dabs on some of Hetty's perfume, a fragrance called moi-même, which in French means myself. She goes on to say that it's a scent she always wanted to try. The fact that Ali feels drawn to the moi-même perfume says to me that something about Hetty in general, and the borderline structure in particular, captures Ali's own identity crisis, feeling a little lost as a newcomer in the city, and overly relying on Sam, a rare trusted person in her environment who hurt her terribly. Their relationship is shown to be one in which Ali invests so much of herself. He informs her thought process and influences life choices that she makes. The film subtly hints in this perfume try-on moment that it can be so easy to embody the values of another person, especially when one feels vulnerable and in a state of flux. The dabbing of the fragrance is like a ceremonial transference of energy, marking an unconscious recognition within Ali that something about Hetty reminds her uncannily of herself. Until next time.
A big thank you to the wonderful Mary Wilde. And don't forget, if you want to hear more of Mary's takes on cinema and genre movies, then subscribe to her Patreon channel, patreon.com/Mary Wilde. So, Maha, any final thoughts on Single White Female before we wrap up? I mean, how do you think this film kind of holds up, especially in comparison to The Hand That Rocks the Cradle?
I love it. I think it's a really fun watch. Again, it's one of those things where you have to say this was made in 1992, so there's a very reductive gay stereotype who was simply there to help the white female protagonist.
Yes.
But I think
and dated haircuts, that's fair to say.
Oh, yeah, and dated haircuts, but bold haircuts.
Bold.
I think this film's really fun. It's really well paced. It's very efficient. There's nothing in there that doesn't need to be in there. In fact, if anything, I could have used a little bit more sometimes. And it's visually so striking. The way that this film's shot is very deliberate, and I feel like you could learn a lot. Like if you're a budding filmmaker, you want to learn about shot composition.
Yeah,
have a peek of this film.
Totally.
And yeah, I think it's really fun, and it's a type of film that wouldn't be made today, but for good reason, because I think we are in a different place now, which is good. Like I think we treat mental health and sexual assault very differently now, which we should. But yeah, like watch it as a very interesting timestamp of 1992 erotic thrillers.
Completely agree. And actually, I think having rewatched a bunch of them recently, I think this is top tier erotic thrillers for me. Like, I think it is like one of the better made, more thoughtful ones out of all of these movies we've been talking about. I really like it too. Now, Maha, have you seen the direct-to-video 2005 sequel, Single White Female 2, The Psycho?
What?
Yeah.
The Psycho, because it wasn't clear enough.
I know. I wonder. I mean, you just know already that movie's going to be far more reductive than the original.
And it's also the 2000s. Like, okay, we talk about the 90s as if it was like some weird Victorian era. The 2000s was so much worse.
Oh, the 2000s were a step backwards for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Like there was like this kind of ladette era of like feminism where like if you wanted to be a feminist, you had to like be bawdy. I don't know. Like I feel like somehow the 2000s were actually worse, and I think Britney Spears would agree.
100%. It bro culture took over in the 2000s. Even when you look at comedy movies, you know the American Pie films to whatever else, like the Hangover films, like it became much more men again kind of thing. Like
Definitely.
After these kind of female-centric movies of the 90s, you know.
It was like, okay, you want to hang out with the boys, you want to be in, traditionally male spaces, and you have to accept everything.
Yes.
We're not going to change for you.
Yeah.
And you have to take everything as a joke. So yeah, tell me about this, the single white female, the Psycho.
I have not seen it, but all I know is, it came out in 2005, direct to video. I think it's got a 0 score on Rotten Tomatoes. I don't think anyone liked this film, and I don't recognise any of the names involved in it. It stars somebody called Kristen Miller, directed by somebody called Keith Samples. I don't know. Anyway, probably not worth watching. Just thought I would give it a mention because I love that it exists.
Should I watch it?
I feel like maybe we should watch it at some point,
like we
right?
should watch it. I mean, why not?
Yeah.
I did just say that, I'm okay with being uncomfortable. So I feel like I need to walk the talk.
I'm reading a plot synopsis now on Wikipedia, and there's a moment in the plot that says this: when Holly follows Tess to an underground nightclub called Sin, she realizes that the girl must be deranged.
Okay, so they're saying the quiet part out loud.
Yes,
they're
exactly.
taking the subtext and making it text.
Yes, exactly that.
Okay.
That. Well, there you go. I love it. Amazing. Well, Maha, that is it, I think. Thank you so much for joining me to discuss these two films. What an absolute pleasure it's been. And my final question for you that I'm going to spring on you now. What is your favourite home invasion movie?
Okay, I have to say that I probably haven't watched as many as other guests on this illustrious podcast. You know what? Home Alone.
Oh my God, incredible choice. And also, what a brilliant segue, because we are covering Home Alone next week on this very podcast.
I can't wait.
Amazing choice. Maha, thank you so much for joining me. And just remind people, if they want to come and find you, more of your work, your video stuff, and whatever else you've been doing out there online, where can they find you?
They can find me on the BFI's YouTube, where a lot of my videos are. You can find me on Instagram, Maha on Insta. And where else can you find me? And you can find my videos all over MTV's socials, because I also freelance for them.
Amazing. Maha, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Mike.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my brilliant guest, Maha Albadrawi. Such a joy to chat about those two movies. So much fun. I would love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of The Hand That Rocks the Cradle and Single White Female? Please do get in touch. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com, and you can find us on all the socials: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, etc. If you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, join the discussion group, the Evolution of Horror discussion group, which you can find on Facebook, or you can also join our Discord. That's the Evolution of Horror Discord. If you want to support this podcast financially and get treated to a whole bunch of regular bonus content, then sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare moment, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week then. And next week, Christmas really is coming early in more ways than one. Next week, I'm going to be joined by friend of the pod, Rob Watts, to discuss two incredible home invasion movies from the late 80s and early 90s. Next week, we are going to be discussing Deadly Games from 1989, followed by a little-known horror classic, Home Alone from 1990. So all of you that have been complaining week after week that what we've been discussing isn't true home invasion, you can calm down, because now we've got two absolutely quintessential home invasion movies, Deadly Games and Home Alone. There's no arguing with that double bill, right? Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.